Hello and welcome back. My name is Erin Ferguson, and today's video is going to be a tutorial on how to draw different body types. A lot of you who follow me probably follow me for my series about creating the art for a 2D video game. Rest assured that project is still ongoing and I will be back with more updates in the coming weeks, but a lot of what I'm working on right now is the same as things I've been working on in the past, so rather than repeat, the same topics for videos, I thought I would go ahead and do a tutorial today. So last week, if you watched my video, I did a tutorial about drawing different facial expressions, and so I thought I would build on that this week, and I will be doing a demonstration about how to draw different body types, especially for different ages and for different genders, and then variations within those different categories. So hang on just a second. I will switch over to my screen and we can get started. Okay, I am back and we've got Photoshop open here, and I'm going to apologize in advance for any rumbling you hear in the background because we've got like a crazy storm brewing out here. There's not much I can do to make it any quieter except maybe try and drown it out with some ambiance music, but if you hear thunder in the background, that's what's going on. So let's go ahead and get started. So when I am drawing the human figure, I always start with something we affectionately refer to as the bean. And the bean is kind of what it sounds like. I mean, it looks like a bean. But it is actually the most basic and simple representation of a human torso. So it's basically like if you were to stick two tennis balls or two potatoes in a big long sock. You would have this nice flexible bit here in the middle, and then on top you'd have two solid masses. So this top mass represents the rib cage, and the bottom mass here represents the pelvis. And basically with this simple structure you can build any sort of human body, and that's actually what we're going to be mostly focusing on today, is how variations of the bean can be used to develop all different kinds of body types. Now, when I'm drawing the figure, I need to point out something really quick, because the way I used to draw the figure, and the way I think a lot of people draw the figure, is by starting with the head first. So they start with the head, do that first, and then maybe they'll move on to the torso, and then they usually do the arms and the legs last. They kind of work from top to bottom. But I actually have found a way that I think works a little better, and I can't really take credit for it. I got this idea from, let's see, I forget his first name. The last name is Hogarth, and he wrote a book. It's called, I want to say, Dynamic Figure Drawing. I will try and remember to link that below so you can look it up if you're interested. But he makes the argument that when you're drawing the figure, you should always start with the torso first. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because his argument is, you cannot move your torso without it affecting every other part of your body. And that's basically true. I mean, if you twist your torso from side to side, your shoulders are going to move, your arms are going to move, your head's going to move, chances are your legs are going to have to move in order to counterbalance, what's going on with your torso. And so he argues that you should draw the torso first. And that's how I generally draw figures now. So the order he suggests is to start with your torso, and then do the legs second. And that makes a lot of sense too. Although your legs aren't going to affect as many parts of your body, it is possible to lift a leg without affecting everything else. For the most part, if you shift your stance at all, everything else is going to have to follow in order to counterbalance or to rebalance so that you can stay upright. It's really hard to move your legs without it affecting at least some other part of your body. Then he says to move on and do the arms next. And if you're following, this pattern, the arms, of course, you can move your arms quite a bit without affecting any other parts of your body. It's really only at the most extreme ranges of motion, when you're really reaching far for something, that it is going to affect anything else, that you might have to lean, or you might have to counterbalance a bit with your legs, if you're pulling something. But for the most part, there's a lot that you can do with your arms that's not going to affect the rest of your body. And very last, he suggests that you draw the head. So the head, if you think about it, you can turn your head from side to side, look up and down. You can basically go through a full range of motion with your head without ever having to move any other part of your body. So it makes sense, rather than trying to build the body from, the head to, down, to build it from the torso out. And so that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on today. So let's take a minute to look at the different variations of the bean, like by age. So let's start with like babies/toddlers. When I'm going to do like a baby or a toddler, basically someone underneath the age of like, I'm going to say like 3. I start with my bean, but I am going to change the proportions of my bean. I want, and especially because I cartoon for the most part, this applies if you're doing really realistic drawing as well, but because I am more of a cartoonist, I am going to exaggerate these proportions. But if I am going to draw a baby or a toddler, I am going to make them very bottom heavy. See, notice how like the rib cage is very small, and the pelvis here is very large. And so this is a big pelvis. And the reason I do that is for a number of, I do it for a number of reasons, but if you've ever watched a baby or a toddler walking around, they tend to be very bottom heavy anyway. They have, short stocky legs, little thick thighs, and they're made to basically, because they're unsteady on their feet, they're made to fall down and land on their backsides a lot. If they weren't so bottom heavy, when they'd fall over, you'd risk like a head injury. But because they are so bottom heavy, they fall straight onto their little backsides. And so for that reason, I really exaggerate this bottom circle. The other reason too is most of the time, little babies and toddlers are going to be wearing like diapers, which makes their hips look wider anyway. So for a baby and toddler, I err on the side of having a much, much bigger bottom there. And also what I will do is I will give them a great big head. If you've ever looked, at a little kid, if you've ever had a little kid and told them to reach their arm over their head and tap their opposite ear or tap their opposite shoulder, they can't do it. Their arms are just plain too short and their legs are too short. If anything, they might be able to reach the top of their head, and that's about it. So when I'm doing like a small child or like a toddler, someone who's about 2 or 3, I give them a great big head, almost as big as their whole torso. They might be, between their head and their torso, they might be about 2 heads tall. And their legs, I keep very short, and their arms I will also keep very short. So you notice how these proportions, with these short arms, short legs, it looks, very childlike. And I'll usually keep the legs and the arms quite thick too, just because I think it adds to that charm. Not to say that kids can't have, you can't have a skinny little toddler, but generally keeping them fairly compact, I think, makes them look much more, much more childlike. Now, if we move on to children, and I'm talking about kids that are between the ages, like prepubescent kids, so maybe between the ages of like 4 and 11 years old. At this age, body types are going to be pretty much the same, regardless of, gender. And so when I move into children, this is where my bean is going to be the most proportionate from top to bottom. So usually for kids, I will do the top and the bottom of the bean. So the rib cage and the pelvis are going to be just about the same size. Especially kids at the top end of the spectrum who are more, closer to like 11 years old, they tend to get pretty lanky at this time, a little bit lanky, a little ungainly while they're kind of growing into their bodies. But you'll notice that between males and females at this age, there really isn't much difference. So I will keep them fairly rectangular, straight up and down. Again, I will err on the side of them having larger heads. Because, they just do. In proportion to their body, children at this age are going to have larger heads. As for their legs and arms, they're going to be a little bit lankier, than they would be, say, at this stage. But you'll notice that everything is fairly up and down. There's a lot of straight lines with kids at this stage. Because they haven't gone through puberty, basically the way that we can differentiate girls from boys, there are a lot of stylistic choices you can make. Certainly you can give girls long hair or eyelashes or whatever, but usually one difference I will make if I'm trying to differentiate girls from boys at this stage when there really aren't a lot of differences in their bodies, I will make the girls build them out of more circular shapes. So, for instance, I would be much more soft, not having as many, harsh angles. And for boys, I would tend to build them out of more square or perhaps like triangular shapes than I would girls. Maybe give them a thicker neck, maybe slightly more square jaw. There, you can see kind of a difference. One figure looks slightly more masculine than the other, even though, their proportions and stuff are basically the same. You can see how one figure tends to look more feminine with the curves and one tends to look more masculine. So those are little changes that you can make, to make one figure look more male and one more female, while still keeping the proportions relatively the same. Alright, so once puberty hits, that's when it gets fun. That's when we start seeing more differences. So for adults, let's start with females. Again, I'm going to follow that rule of using more circles for females, because circles just tend to be more feminine. Now, obviously, there is a huge range of different body types among, there's many body types as there are people, but this is just somewhere for you to start. Now, with females, once they hit puberty, you tend to start seeing more of a violin shape in the bean. So whereas with little kids, we had a really small rib cage, really big pelvis. With children, they tend to be just about the same size. Once you get older, once females start to, mature, we start to see more of the violin shape, where you get a smaller oval on top and a bigger oval on bottom, and it's pinched in the middle. So in the middle, if you imagine this being like two tennis balls, in a sock, it tends to get a little bit pinched in the middle. Now, the difference with males, of course, is males are basically inverted, and I will tend to start squaring my bean a little bit at this stage. So men are going to have a bigger shape, a bigger mass on the top, and a smaller mass at the bottom. And again, like I said, I will start to really square it off at this stage because, of course, it's just reads as being more masculine. Now, of course, there are all different kinds of variations, among men and women, but these are some of the more like classical representations of male versus female. Something else you want to pay attention to also is the way that the legs fit underneath the body. So in men, because they have a shorter, narrower pelvis, in order for them to be balanced, basically their legs have to fit straight up and down, and their feet will fit more or less right beneath them, like this. So there tends to be a lot more straight lines with men. Now with women, because their pelvis is so much wider, in order for them to get their center of gravity beneath them, in order for them to stand up straight, their thighs, so their femur, I guess that is the femur, right? I think that's the femur, your thigh bone there, it has to curve inward. So you will tend to see even this curve of the body will be continued in the shape of the thighs. And so there you'll have the feet underneath, but you can see the difference, here with this curve versus this straight up and down here. You will also see something similar with the arms. So the arms kind of have to follow the curve of the body. So sometimes men, they'll carry their arms, because they have this wide chest here, they'll carry their arms more outward like this. Whereas women, because they have a narrow waist, will carry their arms more pinched inward like this. So whereas men, forms an angle this way with their arms, women go the opposite way. And as for the head, this is when the head starts to get more, in proportion to the body. And generally when you draw, full-grown adults, especially with women, their body will be somewhere between 6-7 heads tall. Men sometimes can be 7 to 8 heads tall. But as you can see, it's smaller in proportion to the rest of the body as opposed to, say, children or, of course, babies and toddlers. Okay, so next let's talk about the elderly. So our elderly friends, this is when gravity starts kind of catching up to you. So for little kids, And especially like babies and toddlers. Babies and toddlers and children almost seem to like defy gravity. They've got these huge heads, and yet and somehow they, still stay upright even though they've got these, massive heads. They're running around all over the place. They're jumping off the floor. I mean, if you've ever seen like a little toddler running around, so here's our bean, here's his huge head, here's his arms. I mean, they're just like constantly in full motion. But once you get older, that's when gravity starts to make, more of a difference. That's when gravity starts to catch up to you. And at this stage, this is when I will start to take this bean shape and start to bend it over, just as a normal posture. So, of course, if you're moving around, your body is going to bend in the middle. But as opposed to, this straight up and down posture that we see in, children and adults and babies, with the elderly, it starts to get more hunched over. And as you can see, in order to counterbalance that, you're going to need to, more bend in the knees. So with like an old woman, I'm going to use that same, bean shape. Here we go. Aw, how cute is she? There we go, she's happy. With an old woman, I'm going to use that more bean shape that I would, that more feminine curved shape. I'm going to do more bend in the knees. Maybe she needs a little something to help her balance, and so here are her hands on a cane. But as you can see how much older she looks already just by adding this extra bend. And the same thing with, an older man. I would simply use that more square bean, just like that. Bend it in the middle. He can hold his cane too. There, they can have matching his and hers canes. Even though these are really scribbly and rough, obviously, you can still tell that these are older people right here, just by the posture. And so posture can go a long way toward communicating somebody's age. Now let's talk about different bean variations. So if you want to draw, a bunch of adult women, but you don't want them all to look the exact same, there are a lot of variations that you can do on your bean. Of course, there's the classic violin shape that we talked about. If you want to do a woman who's heavier, you might get, bigger circles on the bottom and on the top. If you want to do a woman who's super lean, you can do super skinny ovals as opposed to circles. And there are even women, who are, of course, have wider shoulders than hips, who have features that are inverted, from others. But if we use that circle shape, it still looks, more feminine than if we were to use, rectangles or triangles or anything like that. So there's a lot of different variations that you can do to make, different body types, even among, somebody the same gender and same age. Same thing with men. We could do you've got your classic small square on bottom, big square on top. But you could also go, majorly if you want to do superhero proportions. You could have, tiny square on bottom, huge one on top. If you want to do somebody who's long and, that's really long. If you want to do somebody who's long and skinny, small, you can do small, what are these, squares on top and bottom. You can even do, of course, like women. Some men are probably a little bit inverted as well, and so you can do something like this. But by using more square shapes and, straight up and down legs and the way they hold their arms, it can still look more masculine than, feminine, even though maybe there's a man with wider hips. So the bean here is really just a skeleton for you to make lots and lots of different body types. As long as you pay attention, to other things, other visual cues, pay attention to the angles of the legs and the angles of the arms and what kind of shape language you're using. Even if I were to do, a very inverted female, bean here that's big on top and small on bottom, if I pay attention to those other things, the way she holds her arms, the way her legs are shaped, and the posture of her legs, that still reads as female because I've used, circles here. Same thing with this, more masculine. We'll do the inverted, male figure here. I'm going to use a more, square shape for his head, give him more of a jaw, have his arms, coming out, and more straight up and down legs. I mean, that still, to me, reads as a man. as opposed to, you know, a very square. I guess it could be a very square woman, but to me that still reads as a man. And so feel free to play around with this formula to try and get, you know, different body types, to have lots of variations in your characters, and of course to be able to express, you know, different ages, from anything from a baby toddler all the way to, you know, an old person. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if you want me to elaborate on anything. As always, I will be back next week with another video. So until then, enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you next Friday.